My name is Daniel Cowan. I'm 48 now, but this happened back in 2011 when I was 34. I had taken a leave from my job in Nottingham after a burnout episode. I was doing contract work for a private logistics firm that mostly worked with the Ministry of Defense. Most of it was boring, paperwork-heavy stuff. Every now and then, I would deliver parcels or secure boxes with no labels, just codes and sometimes a warning about how to handle them. I'd worked 12 years straight and had gotten to the point where everything felt like a gray blur. I couldn't sleep properly. I started drinking. I snapped at people in meetings and didn't even feel bad about it. That was when my boss told me to take a proper break. Paid time off. She even said she'd cover the travel if I stayed away long enough. That's how I ended up at the cabin. It was in the Scottish borders, about 20 minutes off the A7 and another 20 on a narrow, pothole-riddled forestry road. My dad's friend, Alistair, had bought it in the late 90s as a fixer-upper, but never got around to finishing it. He died in 2006, and since then, the place had been sitting unused. When my dad heard I needed somewhere quiet, he gave me the keys and told me to make use of it. No neighbors, no reception, no electricity, just a stove, a rain barrel, and an outhouse. That suited me fine. The first 2 weeks were peaceful. I brought a few crates of canned food, a couple of jerry cans of petrol, and a camp stove. During the day, I read books, walked around the woods, wrote in a notebook, and cooked simple meals. I'd go to sleep not long after dark and wake up early with the birds. The only sounds were wind and birdsong. That silence, it was like medicine at first. But I think now maybe that silence let something else in. Or maybe it just made it easier to notice. It started with the car. I had parked my car, an old Vauxhall Zafira, about 30 feet from the cabin on a clearing covered in flattened grass. One morning, around the start of the third week, I stepped outside to find deep boot tracks leading from the edge of the woods toward the car. They weren't mine. I wore trainers. These were big, heavy boots, almost like military ones. The tracks circled my car once, then disappeared back into the woods. There was no note, no broken window, no scratch or sign of forced entry. I looked around for 10 minutes, thinking it could have been a hiker or poacher. But the nearest footpath was 5 miles away, and poachers didn't usually inspect Vauxhalls. Still, I shrugged it off. There was no threat, just prints in the mud. 2 days later, I noticed something had shifted on the porch. I kept a small hand axe under the log bench out front. I hadn't used it yet, just left it there for kindling if I ever ran out of chopped wood. That morning, it was lying on the bench itself, perfectly parallel to the planks, like someone had placed it there deliberately. I stopped and stared at it for longer than I'd like to admit. That afternoon, I started locking the cabin door. I hadn't been before. It felt pointless when the nearest town was 20 miles off, but I started bolting it shut every night and wedging a chair under the knob. I stopped sleeping with earplugs. Every crack of a branch or rustle of wind kept me wide awake. I kept telling myself I was just being dramatic. Maybe I moved the axe myself and forgot. Maybe those prints were old. Maybe. The knock came on a Thursday, just after 11 p.m. 3 soft knocks spaced out evenly. Not frantic, not timid either. Just a dull thud, thud, thud on the door. I froze. My lantern was off. The fire was dying out. I was lying in bed, reading by torchlight. When I heard those knocks, I didn't move for a full minute. Then, slowly, I switched off the torch and held my breath. No voice followed. No footsteps. Nothing. Just silence. I lay awake all night, listening, holding a knife from the kitchen. It wasn't much more than a butter knife, but it made me feel like I had something. Morning came. I opened the door and saw no one. No note. No footprints. But there was something new, 2 cigarette butts by the edge of the porch. Unfiltered. One burnt down to the stub, the other barely smoked. I went inside and didn't come out for the rest of the day. By that point, I had decided I would leave, but my car wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I opened the hood, checked the cables, everything seemed fine. That evening, I set up a crude signal by the edge of the road, hoping some forest ranger or farmer might see it, but I doubted anyone passed through there often. The next night, there was no knock, but I heard movement in the woods. Slow steps crunching leaves, then silence, then a snapping twig, then silence again. It was always just far enough that I couldn't be sure what direction it was coming from. I didn't sleep. I stayed up by the fire, staring at the door, gripping the knife again. At some point, I heard what I swore was breathing. Not animal breathing, heavy human breathing, just outside the wall. But when I got up and pressed my ear against the logs, it stopped. The next day, I found the back window unlatched. It only opened a few inches, it had rusted mostly shut, but it had been secure when I arrived. I was sure of that. That was when I started searching the entire cabin. Cupboards, attic space, even under the floorboards near the stove. Nothing. The knock came again the next night. This time for knocks. Same pattern. Slow, even. I stayed frozen in bed. I didn't turn on any light. Didn't breathe. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps retreat into the woods. When the sun rose, I went outside with the axe this time. There was a small pile of wood by the side of the cabin. It hadn't been there before. The logs were dry and neatly stacked, like someone had done me a favor. But on top of the pile, there was a single item, a file folder, plain brown. No markings. Inside were 3 photographs and a small slip of paper. The first photo was of me, chopping wood on my 3rd day there. The second was me walking near the rain barrel. The third was me sleeping, visible through the front window, half covered in my blanket. The paper said one thing: "You're not supposed to be here." I nearly vomited. I ran to the car again and tried to start it, knowing full well the battery was dead. It didn't even click. Then I locked myself back inside the cabin, shut all the blinds, and began packing. That night, there were no knocks. But in the morning, I found the file folder was gone. The pile of logs too. The only thing left in their place was a pair of black gloves, laid flat on the porch. The air had changed by then. Even the birds were gone. I made a plan to hike out the next morning. I knew there was a forestry station about 10 miles north, near the Tweed. I would leave at dawn, just take what I could carry, leave the rest, and walk fast. That final night was quiet. No knocks, no movement, no breathing. But at sunrise, when I stepped outside with my bag and boots, I saw a man sitting on the porch bench, like he'd been waiting for hours. He was wearing a dark green overcoat, polished leather gloves, and plain boots. His hair was gray at the temples, and his face looked clean but weathered, like someone who had been military but didn't like to talk about it. His expression was still, not angry, not cold, just flat. He stood up, nodded once, and handed me a piece of paper. Then he walked into the woods and never looked back. The paper was a warning from the Crown. It didn't say Crown outright, but it had a crest, a signature, and a case number. It told me I had unknowingly entered an area of restricted historical significance, and that I was expected not to disclose or revisit the location. That was all. No threats, no fines. Just a polite reminder that I shouldn't have been there. When I returned to the cabin for my bag, the air smelled like cleaning fluid. My fingerprints were gone from the doorknob. My mug was washed and dried. The ash from my fireplace had been swept out. Everything was in order, too clean. I left and hiked north until I found the ranger station. From there, I took a cab to Galashiels and got a mechanic to tow my car out. The battery, as it turned out, was perfectly fine. It had been unplugged. I never went back. I never told the police or the media. I don't even talk to my dad about it. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone, I think about those photos. I think about that man's face, and I wonder how many other places like that exist. Places that don't show up on maps, where silence is enforced not by laws but by presence. Sometimes I wake up thinking I heard a knock. Always slow, always even. 3 or 4, never more. The cabin sat alone, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The kind of place where the trees seem to stretch endlessly, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, where the only noise you hear at night is the rustling of the leaves and the occasional distant howl of some animal. The kind of place people come to get away from everything, to be alone with their thoughts. Or at least that's why I was there. It was October, the air cold enough to bite through your jacket, but not unbearable. Perfect hunting weather, really. I had come up here with the intention of spending the weekend hunting deer, a solo trip for some quiet time, a chance to clear my head, get away from the noise of the world for a while. The cabin itself was old, weathered wood with a sagging roof that had seen better days. The paint was chipped, the front porch creaked underfoot as I stepped up, and the chimney had a thick layer of moss growing along its stone surface. I'd rented the cabin from a guy I'd met a few months earlier at a gun shop in town. He was an older man in his 60s, with a gravelly voice and a no-nonsense attitude. I figured he knew what he was doing when he mentioned the cabin. He assured me it was the perfect spot for hunting. I opened the door and stepped inside, immediately hit with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly musty, but not unpleasant. The interior was simple. A single room with a small wood stove, a table with mismatched chairs, and an old leather couch that looked like it had been there for decades. The kitchen area was barely more than a counter with a propane stove, a small sink, and a fridge that hummed in the corner. Everything was rustic but functional. It was cozy in a way that made you feel like you could curl up by the fire and forget the world existed. I unloaded my gear, setting up my hunting rifle by the window and stowing my clothes in the small bedroom off to the side. After a quick dinner of canned beans and some jerky, I stoked the fire and settled in for the night. The sun had already set, and the forest outside was dark, save for the occasional flicker of moonlight between the trees. I hadn't heard a single car on the road all day, and I knew I wouldn't hear another until I left. I was alone, just the way I wanted it. The night was cold, the kind of cold that crept into your bones when the wind picked up. As I sat by the fire, the wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees, sending occasional rattles through the cabin's old windows. The storm, which had been threatening all afternoon, finally made itself known. Rain began to tap against the roof, heavy at first, then easing into a steady rhythm. I took my time getting ready for bed, a little worn from the long day. The cabin creaked as I lay in bed, the wind rattling the loose windows, but I wasn't worried. I was used to the sounds of a place like this, old, creaky, and alive with nature. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, the fire still crackling in the other room. It was a sound that woke me, a sharp, sudden creak, like someone had stepped onto the porch. I rolled over in bed, disoriented, my heart pounding in my chest. I lay still for a moment, straining to listen. The storm outside was louder now, wind whistling against the walls and rain pouring in sheets against the roof. Nothing moved in the cabin. I was alone, but the sound, it was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise. My rifle, still leaning against the wall near the window, was within arm's reach. I grabbed it, the familiar weight of it grounding me for a moment. Then, slowly, I crept toward the front door, careful not to wake the cabin with unnecessary noise. The wind howled again, louder this time, as if it were trying to cover up the sound of something else. The door was locked, but I had the key on a hook just inside. I hesitated, staring at the door, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The wind outside swirled with a sudden ferocity, and I knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't just the storm. I could feel it in my gut. I turned the key in the lock, slowly, trying not to make a sound. The door creaked as I pulled it open, the cold air immediately rushing in. The porch was empty. The only sign of life was the gusting wind and the heavy rain. No footprints in the mud, no sign of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been out there, watching. I stepped outside onto the porch, the rain pelting me instantly, soaking through my jacket in seconds. I scanned the trees in the distance, but the rain was too thick to see much. Nothing moved, just the endless blackness of the woods. I stayed there for a while, my rifle in hand, eyes darting around as the wind and rain continued their assault. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig, had my senses on edge. I felt exposed. It was strange. I was alone in the woods, but I didn't feel alone. I felt like something was out there, waiting. Eventually, I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't explain what I'd felt, but I knew something was wrong. I tried to shake it off, but it wasn't easy. The rest of the night passed in fitful sleep. The storm outside and the strange sensation that I wasn't alone keeping me awake longer than I wanted to admit. By the time morning came, the storm had mostly passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness in the air. The ground was soaked, and the trees outside were dripping wet, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a muted light over the forest. I forced myself to get up, still feeling uneasy. The whole night had felt off, but the cabin was still standing, the fire still burning in the stove. There were no signs of anyone else being around. Maybe it had just been my imagination. I grabbed my rifle and headed out the back to check the nearby trails. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft, muddy. The tracks from last night were gone, washed away by the downpour. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, the forest more alive with sounds I couldn't quite identify. My footsteps were muffled in the wet earth, and the leaves crunched softly underfoot. I moved cautiously, keeping my senses sharp, scanning the trees as I walked. Then I saw it, a break in the tree line just up ahead. I approached it cautiously, every nerve on edge. I stepped around a thick trunk and froze. There, in the clearing, was something I hadn't expected. A tree stump, old and weathered, but it was the thing on top of it that caught my attention. A single, dirty glove, lying across the stump like someone had dropped it there in a hurry. I took a deep breath, the hairs on my neck prickling again. I couldn't explain it, but the sight of that glove sent a chill through me. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen anyone since I'd arrived. The thought of someone else being out here, someone who had been watching me, twisted my stomach into knots. I turned back toward the cabin, suddenly feeling very much like the prey rather than the hunter. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get in the truck and drive out of here. But I knew I had to finish what I came for, even if that meant I'd have to keep my guard up. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I had checked my gear and made the decision. I would leave. I didn't know who had been outside the cabin that night or why the woods felt so much more dangerous, but I knew it wasn't worth risking it. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just the storm getting to me, but I didn't want to take chances. The trip out of the woods was long, the rain from the night before turning the roads slick and muddy. My truck bounced over the uneven terrain, and I felt a slight relief as the cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror. Whatever had been out there, it could stay. I didn't look back. I'd always thought of the cabin as a quiet retreat, an escape from the noise of the world. But after spending so much time in that old, creaky place, I started to feel different about it. That wasn't how I'd expected things to unfold when I inherited it. The farmhouse had belonged to my grandfather, and when he passed, the cabin was left to me. I was never close with him. He'd been distant, always a man of few words, more comfortable in his solitude than with family. But after his passing, the cabin became mine. It was isolated, sitting far off from any town, surrounded by acres of old farmland, quiet woods, and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I never thought twice about it. It seemed like a good place to go when life got too loud. The cabin was small, built from timber that had started to weather with age. A few walls were sagging, and there were spots where the roof leaked when it rained too hard. It had been a working farm long ago, but now it was just the cabin, overgrown fields, and an old barn that had fallen into disrepair. I wasn't much of a farmer, but I figured I'd use the place for weekends, maybe some time off to reset, get away from the rush of city life. I arrived there on a Friday afternoon, the sun still hanging high, casting long shadows across the dirt road leading up to the cabin. The air smelled like earth and pine, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace, that kind of calm you only find in remote places. I threw my bags inside, unpacked, and opened the windows to let the breeze in. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The first couple of days were quiet. I spent most of my time outside, clearing some of the overgrown weeds around the cabin. The barn was barely standing, its roof caved in, half the walls crumbled. I didn't feel the need to fix it up. It wasn't a priority. I knew no one would come by. No one ever did, and that's how I liked it. Just the wind, the birds, and the occasional deer wandering through the woods. The nights were peaceful too, cold, but peaceful. But on the third night, something changed. It started off innocently enough. I cooked myself a simple dinner, some rice, beans, and a bit of sausage. As the night wore on, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees outside. The fire crackled in the old stove, and I sat down with a book, hoping to enjoy the solitude. There's something calming about being alone in a place so far removed from others. But the calm didn't last. I started hearing sounds outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the perimeter of the cabin. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks or maybe a raccoon, something small moving through the brush. I didn't get up to check. I wasn't scared. But as the night went on, the noises persisted, getting closer, like someone was pacing outside, circling the cabin. It was the kind of noise that made you think twice. It didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, or a raccoon, or any animal I'd heard before. There was purpose behind it, deliberate movements. I stood up from my chair, my heart starting to beat faster, and walked to the window. I peeked out, but the night was thick with darkness. Nothing but the silhouette of trees and shadows. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no figure standing there, just the steady wind brushing against the branches. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd had too much time alone out here, and my mind was starting to play tricks on me. So I turned the lights off, locked the doors, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. The noise continued, this time more distinct. Someone was standing outside the cabin, just out of view, waiting. I could feel it, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. My eyes stayed open in the dark, listening. A faint tapping on the window, too quiet to be a branch in the wind, like someone was pressing their fingers against the glass. I forced myself to get out of bed and grab the flashlight. I didn't know what I thought I'd find, but I couldn't just lie there in the dark anymore. I crept toward the window and pointed the flashlight out. Nothing, just the empty field, the edge of the forest beyond. I waited, scanning the shadows. My pulse raced in my ears, and every rustle of the wind made me jump. Then I saw it, a shadow, not far from the cabin, just beyond the tree line. It was tall, too tall, standing perfectly still like it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The light trembled in my hand as I pointed it directly at the figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the night. It was so strange, too still to be an animal, but too far away to make out any details. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong about it. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the way it stood, or the way it didn't move, but it unnerved me. I didn't think. Instinct took over. I grabbed my coat, shoved my boots on, and bolted out the door. The cold air hit me, sharp and biting, but I didn't care. I was running, the flashlight bouncing in my hand as I sprinted toward the spot where I'd seen the shadow. My breath came out in clouds, and the ground beneath my boots felt uneven, slippery with dew. The cabin was already a distant blur behind me. As I neared the spot, I slowed down. The woods were dense here, trees twisted together like a maze. I didn't know why, but I felt a sense of urgency to find the figure, to understand what it was. The silence around me was thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from every direction. I reached the place where I'd seen the shadow. Nothing. The trees were empty. No figure, no movement. I stood there, listening, my flashlight sweeping through the darkness. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it, if I'd just seen a trick of the light or maybe a reflection off the trees. But then I heard it. Something in the distance, the sound of footsteps, slow and methodical, like someone walking deeper into the woods. I turned and followed the sound, my feet crunching against the underbrush, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I shouldn't have gone further. I should have turned back, but something in me couldn't stop. I needed to know what was happening. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. I paused, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound, but it was gone. For a few moments, I stood there in the stillness, the only noise being the wind rustling through the leaves. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something press against my chest. A weight, a presence just behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the trees. There was nothing there, nothing but shadows and branches. My skin prickled with cold, and a tightness in my chest made it hard to breathe. I couldn't stay out there anymore. I turned on my heel and sprinted back to the cabin, my lungs burning as I ran. When I reached the porch, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My heart raced, my hands shaking as I gripped the edges of the wooden counter, trying to steady myself. I didn't know what had happened or what I'd seen, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. The next morning, everything was still. The sunlight crept in through the trees, casting warm beams of light across the porch. The world felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like nothing had happened the night before. I didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the day. I stayed inside, locked the door, and tried to ignore the feeling of eyes on me from every corner. It was hard to shake the idea that someone or something was watching. That night, I didn't hear the footsteps again. I didn't see the figure by the trees. It was as if everything had returned to normal. But I couldn't forget what I'd felt, what I'd sensed, and I knew deep down that the peace I'd found there wasn't real. The cabin had secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. And even though everything appeared calm, I understood something important. I wasn't just inheriting a cabin. I was inheriting whatever lingered there, whatever had been left behind in the silence of those old woods. Something wasn't right. I stayed for one more night, and in the morning I left. I didn't know if I would ever return to the cabin again, but I had no plans to stay there any longer. What I thought would be a retreat from the world had turned into something else, something far darker, and I wasn't ready to face whatever it was. It was 2014 when I took a job I didn't really want. I was 32, living just outside a small town called Grand Ridge in northern Idaho, and between jobs after the construction company I'd worked at downsized. I had a few months of savings left, but things were getting tight. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and figured I'd get back into full-time work before things got desperate. Then a friend of a friend told me about a property manager named Mark who was looking for someone to watch over a remote cabin site through the fall season while some renovations were being done. The job paid just enough and included a place to stay. Sounded boring but easy, quiet. I didn't ask too many questions. I needed money. The cabin was 2 hours north of Grand Ridge, off a small gravel road that cut through the forest like it had been scratched into the land with a dull knife. I drove out in an old Dodge Dakota that I'd kept running longer than it should have been. There weren't any signs along the road, just directions Mark had given me. Take the main road until mile marker 47, then turn right down a smaller trail that ran along the edge of a logging route. I passed no other houses, just forest and hills and sky. When I finally got there, the place looked like a holdover from the 60s. It sat back off the trail a bit, nestled in a patch of tall pine and fir. There were signs of old machinery, an out-of-use wood chipper, a rusted generator on wheels, a shed with doors that didn't close anymore. The cabin itself was 2 stories, with a small kitchen and living area on the main floor, a bedroom upstairs, and a basement that locked from the outside. The power came from a gas generator out back that I had to refuel every few days, and there was a water pump system hooked into a well nearby. The phone lines didn't work, and there was no cell signal, but Mark had left a 2-way radio in the cabin that I could use to check in once a day. The work wasn't much. I was told to keep the place in shape, report any damage, and make sure no one messed with the site. There had apparently been some vandalism in the past. Kids from nearby towns coming up to drink and break windows, that sort of thing. I didn't mind the isolation at first. I liked the quiet. I spent the first few days cleaning up the property, fixing up loose floorboards, trimming back the undergrowth around the cabin. The forest was thick, but the trees weren't overwhelming. The air had a sharp clarity to it that made breathing feel cleaner. The only thing that bothered me early on was how quickly night fell. Out in the woods, you lose daylight faster than you expect. The light drains from the sky by 5, and by 6 it's pitch black outside. The kind of dark you feel in your teeth. I started turning in early, reading by flashlight, keeping the radio nearby. One morning, maybe a week in, I found footprints. They weren't mine. I always wore the same boots, heavy ones with thick treads. These were different, narrower, a different pattern. And they came up from the edge of the trees on the west side, passed behind the shed, and then circled the cabin. Just once. I told myself it was probably someone from town, maybe another worker. I checked the radio and called in to Mark, but got no answer. It wasn't unusual. He told me the signal was weak sometimes, and we didn't have a strict check-in schedule. Still, it sat with me. I started keeping the axe inside after that. 2 days later, I found the back door unlatched in the morning. I swore I'd locked it the night before. I had a routine: double-check the doors, flip off the generator, settle in upstairs. But when I went out that morning, the back door swung a little in the wind. The lock looked untouched, but the latch was undone. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing out of place. But I started sleeping with a knife next to the bed, just in case. The weather turned colder in early October. The trees dropped their leaves fast, and the wind got sharp. I spent more time indoors, kept the fire going longer, tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I told myself it was the solitude, just nerves, city brain trying to adjust to the woods. Then I found the trail. It was narrow and hidden, maybe a few hundred yards west of the cabin. I only found it because I was cutting through the trees, clearing dead branches, and noticed a line of broken twigs and disturbed leaves that looked too neat to be natural. I followed it. It weaved through the woods in tight curves, almost invisible unless you were standing right on it. After about 10 minutes, I came to a clearing. No structure.
No campsite.
Just a clearing with signs that someone had stood there for long periods. A flattened patch of grass. A log that had been cut clean to make a seat. Burned out cigarettes. A food wrapper half buried under dirt. Whoever had been there had stayed a while. I felt exposed standing there, like I was being watched. I turned and walked back fast, not running, but close to it. That night, I pushed the heavy dresser in front of the cabin door. The next week brought the first real storm of the season. The wind howled through the trees, and I had to go out 3 times to keep the generator running. The rain slammed the roof hard enough I had to shout to hear myself think, and I stayed awake all night, listening to the storm chew at the forest. When I finally fell asleep, it was light outside. The storm had passed, and the world looked stripped clean. Everything was soaked, shining with that weird bright glare you get after a hard rain. I stepped outside and saw something that made me freeze. The shed door had been ripped off, not just open, ripped off its hinges and tossed on the ground 10 feet away. Inside, tools were scattered. A crowbar was missing. I went back inside and locked every door, every window, even the hatch to the basement. I stayed inside for the rest of the day. Didn't sleep that night. I kept the knife in my lap and the axe next to the bed. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of smoke. I thought the cabin was on fire. I bolted downstairs, heart racing, but the stove was off, and the air inside was clean. The smoke was coming from outside. I looked through the window and saw it, thin trails rising from the woods, just behind the tree line. Someone had started a fire out there. I didn't go outside. I watched through the window all day. The smoke never thickened. It wasn't a bonfire. It was controlled, small. A signal, maybe, or a cooking fire. By night, the smoke stopped. That evening, the generator died again. I waited an hour. No lights, no sound. Just cold creeping in. I put on my jacket, grabbed the axe, and went out. The path to the generator circled behind the cabin. I stayed low, kept my eyes moving. When I reached it, I saw the fuel line had been cut. Clean, deliberate. Someone was trying to drive me out, or keep me in. I went back inside, locked the door, and started rationing the batteries in my flashlight. I knew I had enough gas in the canisters for another day, maybe 2, but the line was useless until I patched it. I had the tools to fix it, but no way I was going out there again that night. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, then a pause, then the sound of something being dragged. I didn't move. I lay upstairs in the dark, holding the knife in my hand, barely breathing. The dragging sound stopped, then a thump, and then nothing. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw what had been left for me. The axe, embedded in the front door. Someone had stuck it in hard, then walked off. I took it as a message. I packed my bag that morning. I decided I'd hike out. I could make it to the logging road by midday if I moved fast. My truck was parked farther down the trail, and if someone had messed with it, I'd find out when I got there. Either way, I wasn't staying another night. I took the axe with me, strapped it to my pack, and headed east through the trees. I didn't take the main trail. I stayed off path, moving as quickly as I could, checking behind me every few minutes. The forest was silent. No wind.
No birds.
Just the sound of my own footsteps and breath. When I reached the logging road, my heart dropped. The truck was gone. Not vandalized. Not burned. Gone. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud, but they didn't match my treads. They were smaller, narrow, like from an older model pickup. I turned around and ran. I didn't stop. I followed the logging road south, praying for any sign of life. I walked until nightfall, and then another hour past that. Finally, I saw a light, a ranger station, about 10 miles from the main road. I banged on the door until a man opened it. He was in his 50s, graying, wearing a uniform that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. I didn't say much, just that I'd been working up at the Martinson property and my truck had been stolen. He radioed for help. A sheriff came the next morning and took a report. We drove back to the cabin. It was empty, clean, no signs of forced entry. The shed door had been put back on. The axe was gone. The place looked untouched, like no one had ever been there. The sheriff looked at me like I was nuts, told me maybe I'd scared off some kids. Took the report, but I could tell he didn't believe a word I said. I never went back. I moved out of Idaho the following month. Took a job down in Arizona with a construction crew. I never heard from Mark again. I never found out who was out there, but I know what I saw, and I know that whoever was in those woods, they'd been watching for a long time, waiting for something. Maybe it was me, or maybe I just got in the way of whatever they were already doing. Either way, I was lucky to walk away, and I'll never go near a cabin again. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a break from the chaos of city life. I thought it would be the perfect escape, a peaceful spot to clear my head. My name's Jack Bennett, 34 years old, and I had been working nonstop for the past few months. A few days alone in the woods sounded like the perfect solution, so I booked a cabin in a secluded area up in the Appalachian Mountains. It was the kind of place you find only by word of mouth, hidden away in the woods miles from the nearest town. A real retreat, or at least that's what I thought. I arrived late in the evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The air had a crisp bite to it, typical of fall, with the smell of damp leaves and pine filling my lungs as I stepped out of my truck. The road leading up to the cabin was gravel, bumpy, and narrow. It wound around the dense forest, and I had to slow down to avoid potholes and fallen branches. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet in front of me. The cabin itself stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. It wasn't much, an old, wooden structure that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The roof had patches where the shingles were missing, and the paint was chipped and faded. But it was cozy. I could already imagine sitting by a fire with a beer, unwinding. The sort of place that made you feel like you were miles away from anything or anyone. I grabbed my duffel bag from the truck, flicking the lock on the door and stepping inside. The air inside smelled musty, like it had been shut up for a while. The floors creaked under my boots as I set my bag down. There was a small living area with an old stone fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen. The walls were lined with bookshelves, although most of the books looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I set my stuff down, started a fire in the fireplace, and began unpacking. By the time I had the fire going, it was dark outside, and I could hear the wind picking up. It was the kind of wind that howls through the trees, rattling the cabin walls. I wasn't worried, just a little unnerved, but that's part of the charm of being in the woods, right? I made myself a simple dinner, nothing fancy, and ate it by the fire. It was a peaceful evening, just me and the crackling flames, the wind howling outside. Perfect evening, or so I thought. That night, after a few drinks and some quiet reading, I turned in for bed. The bed was firm and the sheets felt rough, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't long before I fell asleep, the sound of the wind outside lulling me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had just started to peek over the horizon, casting a soft glow through the trees. I could hear the birds calling, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. It felt like the world was still asleep, and I had all the time in the world to enjoy the peace. I had planned to do some hiking that day, maybe explore the nearby trails and take some photos. I grabbed a cup of coffee and stepped outside. The air was cool, with a slight mist hanging in the low-lying areas of the forest. The trees were dense here, the kind that made you feel small when you stood among them. As I walked along the small path behind the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks in the mud, footprints, but they weren't animal tracks, at least not any animal I could recognize. They were human, but they didn't look like they belonged to anyone I knew. They were too wide, too heavy, like someone had been walking around here recently. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just some other hiker, someone passing through. But as I continued along the path, the tracks led me further away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. I should have turned back, but curiosity got the better of me. The path wound around a small creek, the water running clear and cold, and then it took a sharp turn, disappearing into thicker brush. The footprints continued, still fresh, as if someone had been walking in front of me just moments ago. I kept walking, the air getting cooler the deeper I went. The trees felt more oppressive now, the branches hanging lower, the underbrush thicker. The silence around me was almost unnerving. I could hear the occasional rustle, the movement of something in the distance, but nothing close. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I pushed forward, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I rounded another bend, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Ahead, standing at the edge of the clearing, was an old, abandoned shack. It was barely standing, just a few walls and a roof covered in moss and vines. But what struck me the most was the way it looked so out of place. There were no other buildings around, no signs of civilization, just this shack, tucked away in the middle of the woods. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert. The door was slightly ajar, and a low groaning sound came from inside. It sounded like the wind, but something about it didn't sit right. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, there was nothing but dust, broken furniture, and the smell of decay. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but again, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here recently. I stood there for a moment, considering whether I should go further. The tracks, the shack, it didn't feel right. But before I could make up my mind, I heard something behind me, a sound light, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, straining to see through the trees, but I couldn't make anything out. It was just the wind, right? I told myself it was nothing. Still, my legs felt like lead as I turned and began heading back down the trail. The tracks in the mud were still there, but I didn't feel alone anymore. There was something else out there, something watching me. I could feel it in my bones, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As I reached the clearing near the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the truck, just outside the cabin, was a figure, person, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. They were facing the cabin, not moving. I couldn't see their face, but I knew, deep down, that I didn't recognize them. I should have gotten in my truck and driven away right then, but I didn't. I stood frozen, my mind racing with thoughts. What was this person doing here? Why hadn't they said anything? For a few seconds, I just watched them. And then, as if sensing my gaze, the person turned around. Slowly, they took a step towards me, and that's when I saw it, the glint of something metal in their hand. A knife. I didn't hesitate. I spun around and bolted into the woods, my heart hammering in my chest. Branches scraped against my skin, the ground uneven beneath my feet as I ran through the underbrush. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, getting closer. The panic set in as I realized I didn't know where I was going. I was lost. I kept running, my breath ragged, the sounds of pursuit growing louder. I didn't know if I was still being followed or if I had lost them, but I wasn't stopping. Not until I was sure I was far enough away. I ran for what felt like an eternity, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. Finally, I stumbled upon a small creek, and I knelt down to catch my breath. The water was cold, and I splashed some on my face, trying to calm myself. The cabin, the figure, the knife, it all felt like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It was real. I sat by the creek for a long time, too terrified to move, listening for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing. Eventually, as the darkness deepened, I made my way back to the cabin, cautiously checking every corner before I stepped inside. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and stayed up all night, too shaken to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and left. The figure in the woods, the tracks, the old shack, they had all been too much. Whatever had happened out there, I didn't want any part of it. I didn't care if the cabin had been a perfect getaway. I wasn't staying another minute. As I drove back down that narrow gravel road, the cabin shrinking in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the first person to have an experience like that. Something about the woods, the silence, the way it all seemed just a little too quiet. It all felt like a warning, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I never went back, and I never will. I was 32 when it happened. I had been working as a carpenter for over a decade, mostly building cabins, sheds, and small outbuildings for people who wanted weekend places out in the woods. That summer had been rough. My dad had passed away in April, and my longtime girlfriend had moved out in May. Work had been slow and money wasn't great. I was in a mood where I just wanted to get away from everything. So when my friend from high school, Adam, called me in early August about needing help finishing a cabin up near the edge of the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois, I didn't think twice about it. Said the client bailed on him halfway through the project, and if I helped him knock it out, we could keep the leftover materials and he'd cut me in on half the cash. I packed up my old Silverado with my gear, a few days of food, some clothes and tools. I figured I'd be up there a week, maybe two. I left Carbondale just before sunset on a Thursday evening. The drive wasn't long, only a couple hours, but the final stretch meant leaving paved roads and cutting through backwoods dirt paths where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. I liked that kind of drive. No noise, no people, no distractions, just trees and dust. The cabin was about 5 miles down an old fire road that used to be used by rangers but had long since grown over. You wouldn't know it was even a road if someone didn't point it out to you. Adam had marked the turnoff with a piece of orange survey tape tied around a dead pine tree. I spotted it right before dusk and made the turn. The road wasn't much more than 2 tire tracks through weeds, with branches scraping along the sides of the truck. Every now and then, I had to stop and clear fallen limbs or pull the truck into a ditch to get around something. After a solid 30 minutes of crawling along in low gear, I finally saw the clearing ahead. The cabin sat right at the edge of a ridge, with trees on 3 sides and a steep drop on the 4th. There was a flat area beside it, where Adam had parked an old trailer and left some tools scattered around. I didn't see his truck. I got out, stretched, and called his name, but the place was quiet. I figured he'd gone back to town for supplies or maybe got stuck somewhere with that ancient diesel he drove. The cabin itself looked mostly finished. Frame was done, roof was on, windows were in. Just needed the siding put on and the interior buttoned up. There was no power, no plumbing yet. Just a dry shell in the middle of the woods. I unlocked the padlock on the front door. He'd texted me the code and stepped inside. Smelled like sawdust and pine. exactly what you'd expect. I laid out my sleeping bag in the corner and cracked a can of soup on my little propane stove. By the time I'd eaten and set up my gear, it was pitch dark outside. Not city dark, real dark. No lights, no cars, just a heavy silence and the hum of bugs in the trees. I didn't sleep great that night. Kept hearing small noises, branches cracking, what sounded like something shifting outside, probably raccoons or deer. Still, I kept my flashlight and my utility knife within reach. In the morning, Adam still hadn't shown. I figured I'd get to work on my own. The first few days were uneventful. I worked sunup to sundown, cutting and installing the cedar siding, putting in insulation, framing a couple of interior walls. I cooked simple meals, drank from a cooler of water I brought, and at night, I listened to a podcast or read by headlamp. It was quiet, peaceful, even. I didn't see a single person the whole time, not even hikers, just trees and animals. By the fourth day, I started getting the sense something was off. Not dangerous, just off. Little things. One morning, I found my hammer lying 10 feet away from where I left it the night before. I chalked it up to being tired, maybe knocking it over by accident. Then I found the side door ajar, even though I knew I'd latched it. A raccoon, maybe. No big deal. But the next night, I was sitting outside on a folding chair with a can of beer, just watching the woods and trying to unwind, when I heard it. A cough. Not loud, not close, but definitely human. Came from down the ridge. I sat up and listened, but the woods were silent after that. I stayed up another hour, watching the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just an echo of my own noise or something falling. I went to bed uneasy. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for footprints or signs that someone had been close. The ground was hard and dry, and I didn't see anything obvious. Still, I started keeping my hatchet with me, even when going to the outhouse I dug behind the trees. That afternoon, I thought I heard something moving in the woods to the east, behind the cabin. I stepped out with my hammer in hand and scanned the trees. Could have been a deer, but the sound had weight to it. 2 legs. I didn't see anything. I climbed onto the roof to check the ridgeline with my binoculars. Nothing, but the woods felt tighter somehow, like they were pressing in. That night, I slept with one ear open. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Light, careful ones, just outside the cabin. I didn't move, just listened. Whoever it was stopped right outside the wall near where I was sleeping. I could hear breathing, slow, quiet, but unmistakable. I reached for my flashlight and knife, heart pounding. Then the sound moved away, slow steps crunching on the dry ground. After a minute, it was gone. I waited till sunrise to go outside. Again, no tracks, no signs. That morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the front porch, sitting dead center on the step, was a crushed beer can. It wasn't one of mine, different brand. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't passed another cabin. It wasn't old, no rust, no dirt. Someone had left it there. I decided to hike out that afternoon. I packed some food and my pistol, which I'd brought but hadn't loaded yet, and started down the path I'd come up. About a mile in, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. A footprint. A boot print, actually. Deep in the mud, fresh, bigger than mine. Someone had walked the same trail recently. I turned around and went back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I stayed awake with the lights off, looking through the front window. Around 1 a.m., I saw something move in the trees. Just a flicker of a figure, barely illuminated by the moon. Whoever it was, they stood still for a long time. Too long. Then they disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I kept working. I figured if I acted normal, maybe whoever it was would lose interest. But I was paranoid now, jumping at every sound. I kept tools beside me like weapons. My hands were shaking when I tried to measure and cut boards. I couldn't stop thinking about that cough in the dark. On the 7th day, I woke up and found the outhouse destroyed. Not just knocked over, smashed in, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. The wood was splintered, the walls broken apart. That wasn't an animal. That was someone trying to send a message. I packed my gear. I was done. But when I tried to drive out, I found the road blocked. A fresh tree, thick and heavy, had been felled across the narrow path. Clean cut at the base. Someone had used a chainsaw or axe. It wasn't there before. Panicked, I tried to pull it aside with the truck, but it wouldn't budge. I had a handsaw, but it would take hours to cut. I turned around and went back to the cabin, locked the door, and waited. That night was the longest of my life. I heard movement all around the cabin. Slow pacing, a thud against one wall, then silence. I sat in the corner with my pistol in hand until morning. At first light, I hauled ass with the saw, sweating and shaking, looking over my shoulder every 10 seconds. It took me nearly 3 hours to cut the tree enough to move it. When the truck finally crawled over it and got back to the fire road, I gunned it like my life depended on it. I didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station near Vienna. I was dirty, exhausted, and still looking over my shoulder. I didn't call the cops. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin at night and left a beer can? That someone broke my outhouse? I never went back. Adam never called again, and I never asked about the job. I don't know if he made it out or if he ever planned on coming back. I tried to forget it, moved on, got new work, but I haven't camped or built anything in the woods since. The worst part of that whole experience wasn't the noises or the figure in the dark. It was the waiting, knowing someone was out there watching me, staying just far enough away to keep me guessing. It was a game to them, and I still don't know how long they'd been out there before I noticed. Maybe they were already watching when I pulled in. It was the middle of October 2022 when I passed her cabin again. Her sister's cabin, I should say. But to me, it was always hers. Emma and I had been divorced nearly 3 years by then, and she'd passed away from a sudden stroke the following spring after we split. She was 39. It was hard to accept, even harder to talk about. We hadn't been on speaking terms when she died. I never got the chance to say anything, to say sorry. That part stuck with me like a cold nail in the spine. Her sister, Danielle, had a place in a quiet patch of forest north of Prince George, British Columbia. They called it a cabin, but it was more like a proper home tucked in the trees. Long gravel driveway, big windows facing west, and a shed that leaned a little from age and snow. Emma used to bring me there sometimes when we were married. It was her favorite place to escape. No cell reception, no internet, just tall pines, the smell of smoke from the wood stove, and quiet. I hadn't been there since we split. I hadn't even been in that part of the province since the funeral. But that week in October, I was driving north to see an old friend in Fort St. James. I'd taken a different road to avoid delays near Fraser Lake, and somehow, without even realizing it at first, I found myself on that long dirt stretch leading to her sister's property. Maybe I did it on purpose. Maybe part of me wanted to see it again, just once. I told myself I wouldn't stop. I'd drive past and keep going. I didn't keep going. The place looked nearly the same, just more weathered. I sat in my truck on the side of the gravel for a long while. The sun was dipping low, casting that orange light that makes everything look older. The wind stirred the yellow leaves on the trees. I figured no one was there. Danielle had moved to Winnipeg a year after Emma's death. I remembered seeing a post about it. I wasn't sure if she'd sold the cabin or what. The gate was open. The mailbox looked untouched for months. I walked up the driveway and stood at the front steps. The silence around that place hit differently than I remembered. Back then, with Emma, it was peaceful. Now it felt like it had been holding its breath too long. I don't know how long I stood there before I tried the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale and dusty. The place hadn't been cleaned in a long time. Mouse droppings on the kitchen counter. A few open cupboards. Dishes still in the sink. There was a sour, earthy smell lingering everywhere. Mold, maybe. I walked through the room slowly, barely touching anything. Her sister must have left it in a hurry. Or maybe she meant to come back and just never did. I stood in the hallway and looked at the door to the back bedroom, Emma's old room when we used to visit. I didn't open it. Something about it made my skin prickle. Not in a supernatural way. It was just heavy, like whatever was behind that door had been waiting too long. I should have left then. That was the moment. But I told myself I'd only stay a little longer, maybe clear my head. I couldn't explain why, but something about being there made all the noise in my brain go quiet. I swept the front room a bit, opened a few windows, and built a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the cold. I figured I'd leave in an hour, maybe 2. Then the sun went down. I hadn't realized how dark it would get. No power, no cell service, no moon yet. The fire crackled behind the glass but didn't throw much light past the small sitting area. I lit a couple of old candles I found in the drawer near the sink and set them up on the coffee table. I found myself sitting on that same worn couch I used to nap on after long hikes with Emma. I stared into the fire and tried not to think too much. But thoughts came anyway. Not memories, just weird, drifting thoughts, like half-dreams. I thought about how Emma used to curl up in that chair near the window with a book and fall asleep with her thumb tucked inside the pages. I thought about the time we tried to hike to that little lake behind the ridge and got lost for 4 hours. I remembered how mad she'd been and how we ended up laughing about it when we found our way back just before dark. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized I wasn't alone anymore. It started with sounds. Small ones. Floor creaks. Shuffling. A cabinet door slowly swinging open in the kitchen. I froze, listening hard. I told myself the place was old. Probably mice. Maybe a raccoon got in. But the noises didn't fit that explanation. The sounds were too heavy, too deliberate. Then came the smell. Not mold or dust, something worse. Rancid, like old meat left in the sun. My throat tightened. I stood up slowly, candle in hand, and walked toward the hallway. The back bedroom door, the one I hadn't opened, was now slightly ajar. I didn't want to go near it. Everything in me told me to leave. But something else pushed me forward. Not curiosity, not bravery, just a kind of numbness, like my body moved before I could think better of it. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell hit me harder then. Something had died in there. I covered my nose with my sleeve and stepped inside. The candle flickered against the old wallpaper. The bed was unmade, sunken in the middle. A few plastic storage bins were stacked near the closet. The source of the smell was on the floor by the far wall. At first I thought it was an animal, a dead raccoon or maybe a fox that had gotten trapped inside. But it wasn't. It was a duffel bag, the kind you'd take camping or on a long weekend. Only it was soaked through with dark, rotted fluid, and flies buzzed lazily around it. I stepped closer and realized the zipper had been forced open. Inside were clothes, not folded, stuffed. Women's clothes, mostly, dirty, torn, some with what looked like dried blood. Underneath them, plastic-wrapped packages, photos, letters, even a small notebook, stained and water-damaged. I backed out of the room slowly. My pulse was pounding. I didn't know what I had stumbled into, but it was bad. I knew that much. I went outside, gulped in the cold air, and stood in the yard trying to make sense of it. The forest around me was black and still. I didn't feel alone anymore, not in the emotional sense. I felt watched, like eyes were somewhere out past the treeline. I grabbed my keys from my coat pocket and started back toward the truck. But I never made it. There were fresh tracks in the dirt near the side of the cabin. Big boot prints. Not mine. Not old. They hadn't been there when I arrived. They led around the back of the house toward the shed. I should have gotten in the truck and gone, but I didn't. Instead, I moved slow, following the prints, heart hammering in my chest. My candle had burned halfway down, and the wind kept threatening to kill the flame. I reached the shed and tried the door. It was locked. There was movement behind it. I froze again, not sure what to do. Then I heard breathing, deep, labored, not from an animal. It was too steady, too human. I backed away slowly. I kept backing until I was near the truck again, and then I turned and got in, locked the doors. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, gravel spitting behind me. My headlights lit the trees as I swung around the bend, and for a split second, I saw someone standing at the tree line near the edge of the property. They didn't move. They just watched me go. I didn't sleep that night. I drove until sunrise, pulled over at a gas station in Vanderhoof, and called the police. I told them I'd found a cabin with signs of forced entry, possibly blood, and what I thought might be evidence of a missing person. I didn't give my name. I didn't want to be involved. A few days later, I saw an article online. The cabin had been searched. Police found biological evidence connected to at least one missing woman reported the year before. They were asking for help identifying the owner of a duffel bag containing what they called personal effects of interest. No arrests had been made. No further details. I never followed up. I don't know if what I found had anything to do with Emma or Danielle or someone else entirely. I don't know who was in that shed or what they were doing there. All I know is that place had changed. It had soaked in something foul, something broken and dangerous. I haven't been back to British Columbia since. I think about Emma sometimes, in the quiet moments. I think about how she loved that cabin and how peaceful it used to be. That version of the place doesn't exist anymore. Whatever it was back then, it's gone now, replaced by something I don't understand and don't want to understand. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night and the house creaks, I wonder about the tracks behind the cabin. I wonder if whoever made them is still out there, waiting for the next person who wanders in. And I remind myself, I wasn't supposed to stop, but I did, and I saw what I wasn't meant to see. I was 33 when I spent that last fall up near Dawson Creek, British Columbia. I had taken a seasonal job working for a small logging outfit up north, just outside the Pine Pass. It wasn't glamorous or anything, but it paid well, and I was used to the work. Most of my adult life had been spent bouncing between jobs like that. Welding, tree planting, pipeline cleanup, brush clearing, whatever paid and kept me out in the woods. I didn't care much for towns. The job was pretty straightforward. Assist in clearing a section of timber up on a stretch of government land near the edge of the mountains. It was quiet, not heavily trafficked, and the road in was rough. The company had 2 cabins they used for housing. One of them was newer and closer to the trucks and fuel sheds. That's where most of the guys stayed. The other one was older and set a bit farther out, maybe 20 minutes walking if you followed the tree line. I picked the older one. I liked the quiet. No generators humming all night. No arguing over who used the last of the propane. It was just me and whatever was out in the woods. At the time, I thought that was a good thing. The place wasn't much to look at. An old, square-frame cabin with a metal roof that looked like it had been hammered on by a drunk. The windows were thick glass but warped, and the floor had that soft bend to it in some places, like water had gotten underneath at some point and frozen everything out of shape. But it had a stove, a cot, and a stack of firewood already split. That was enough for me. It was late September when I moved in, and we had a solid month of work left before the snow came in heavy. The days were crisp and short, and the mornings were colder than I liked. Still, I felt good. I'd get up before the sun, drink instant coffee over the stove, and walk out to meet the crew at the clearing. I never saw anything strange the first few weeks. There were wolves, of course. One of the guys had his truck chewed up when he left jerky wrappers on the passenger seat. Bears too. I saw a grizzly once, about a half click from the cut site. But that's normal. That's just the woods being the woods. What happened later wasn't normal. I started noticing things on the third week. It was a Thursday. I come back late after helping with some equipment that broke down. The sun was already down by the time I reached the tree line. I could barely see the cabin roof through the branches. I remember getting this strange feeling as I came up the last stretch of trail, like I was being watched, but not in that paranoid city way. It felt direct, deliberate, cold, but I didn't see anyone, just trees and shadows. When I reached the cabin, the front door was open. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't latched it properly that morning. The wind could have blown it open. Still, I checked inside carefully. Nothing was missing, nothing moved. My gear was where I left it. The firewood I stacked inside was untouched. I chalked it up to my own carelessness and shut the door tight behind me. But I started locking it after that. The next night, I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard something outside. It was quiet at first, just a few crunches in the leaves, like someone walking slow. Then it got louder, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I could hear breathing, too. Not deep or angry, just steady. Too steady. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. It felt like if I even shifted on the cot, whoever or whatever was out there would know. The steps moved toward the front of the cabin, then stopped. A long pause. Then I heard this scratching sound. Not nails exactly. More like fingers dragging lightly over wood. Slow. Back and forth. Then it stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, I heard the steps move away again, slow and even. No running. No ruse. Like whoever was out there wanted me to know they weren't scared of me at all. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. That morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were no tracks, not even mine from the day before. The ground was hard-packed, with just a dusting of frost, but still, nothing? No prints, no broken twigs, nothing that made sense. I didn't tell the guys. I didn't want to hear the jokes. That day at work, I felt off. I kept looking over my shoulder while we cut. Every echo of the chainsaw felt like it was being swallowed by the woods. We were hours from any real town, and nobody else should have been out there. Nobody had permission to camp or hike in that area. And that's what bothered me. That night, I triple-checked the latch on the door. I even dragged a few cinder blocks from outside and stacked them against it. I didn't care how it looked. I wasn't taking chances. Around midnight, I woke up to tapping on the window. It wasn't frantic or loud. Just 3 taps. Pause. Then again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. I didn't move. The cot was angled so I couldn't see the window from where I lay. And I didn't want to. My heart was hammering again. I felt sweat in my armpits even though it was freezing in the room. Then I heard it, breathing, but this time it was closer, right on the other side of the glass. I swear I could feel it in the air, like the cold had a heartbeat. Tapped again. Then it started dragging fingers across the glass, just like it had with the wood the night before. Same rhythm, same quiet confidence. I wanted to reach for my axe, but it was by the door. I just laid there, teeth clenched, listening. Eventually, it stopped. The breathing faded. Then silence. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember it being light again. I checked the window as soon as the sun was up. Nothing. Not a single mark. The glass wasn't even fogged. But something had been there. I was sure of it. That day, I started thinking about moving back to the other cabin. But I didn't want to explain why. I didn't want to say I was scared of sounds in the woods like a kid. So I stayed. The next 2 nights were quiet. I thought maybe it had passed. Maybe it was a bear testing territory. Maybe even a sick moose or something. Then the smell came. It was the 5th night. I came back from work, opened the door, and almost threw up. The whole cabin smelled like wet dog and rot. It was thick, like it clung to the air. I looked around, expecting to find a dead animal under the cot or maybe something stuck in the chimney. Nothing. I pulled everything outside, opened the windows, and waited. The smell went away before sundown, just vanished, like it had never been there. But that night, it came back stronger. I lay there breathing through my sleeve, eyes wide, and that same scratching sound started again. This time at the back wall, then the side, then the window. It circled the cabin over and over, but I didn't move. I didn't even blink. That's when I heard it mimic me. A voice, low and raspy, from right outside the wall, saying my own name, like someone had heard me say it once and was trying it on. It didn't sound quite right. The pitch was off, but it was enough. I lost it. I grabbed the axe, threw the door open, and ran outside swinging. I screamed into the trees, into the darkness. But there was nothing. Not a branch moved, not a shadow stirred, just silence. And that smell, still heavy in the air like wet hair and meat. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I packed my bag and hiked straight down the old road to the other cabin. I told them I had seen wolf tracks and needed to stay closer. Nobody asked questions, but that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, one of the guys came back from the clearing early. He looked pale, said he saw someone or something near the ridge above the worksite. Said it looked like a man, but not quite. Too long in the arms. Moved weird. I didn't say anything. That night, back at the main cabin, the generator died. We all heard it, scratching, tapping, all around. Then it said my name again. Same voice, low, dry, wrong. Everyone froze. One guy threw up. Another grabbed his shotgun. We stayed in a circle, backs to the wall, until sunrise. Nobody spoke. That morning, half the crew left. Drove out before the road froze over. I left with them. I didn't tell anyone what I really thought. I didn't say the word, but I knew. The stories I'd heard from old hands and northern trappers came back in full force. They call it different names: skinwalker, shapeshifter, mimic. I don't care what it is. I just know it watched me. It learned me, and it walked like a man that wasn't born one. I sold most of my gear after that. Took a job doing concrete in Alberta. Stayed away from the deep woods. Stayed away from cabins. Even now, almost 10 years later, I keep my windows covered at night. Keep a dog. I don't go camping. And I don't say my name out loud when I'm alone. Because some things don't forget. Some things wait. And I still wake up some nights, in the dark, in silence, and listen for breathing outside my window. It was September of 2016 when I got transferred to a new post in the Sawatch Range in central Colorado. I was 32 at the time, single, and had been working for the Forest Service for almost 8 years. I'd done my share of trail inspections, wildlife surveys, and fire watch, but this assignment was different. They needed someone for a full-time position at a remote cabin up near Lake Lily, an area so deep in the mountains that it wasn't accessible during the winter unless you had a snowcat or a damn snowmobile. The Forest Service wanted eyes on that area before the first heavy snow came through. They gave me a 4-wheel drive truck, a sat phone, a radio, and told me it'd be a solo post for 4 weeks. I was to document any signs of poaching, illegal hunting, squatters, or suspicious activity. The area had a history of missing hikers and a few unsolved cases. I didn't think much of that part, honestly. In this job, you see a lot of folks get in over their heads with nature. Poor planning, bad weather, wild animals, that sort of thing. I left the district office early on a Tuesday. The weather was fair, and I made it up the dirt roads and switchbacks with no real problems. The drive took a couple hours longer than expected. Once I got past the last forestry gate, it was just rough trail. No cell service past the second ridge. The map showed the ranger's cabin near the lake, surrounded by dense pines and a steep hillside. It was built back in the late 60s, mostly used for fire watch during the summer and hunting patrols in the fall. When I finally got there, the place was smaller than I imagined. A single-story structure with a green tin roof, a porch that looked like it had been repaired more than once, and a locked shed out back that held tools, fuel, and a backup generator. There was a propane tank behind the cabin, and they'd stocked it up before I arrived. Inside, it had everything I'd need: a small bed, a wood stove, a kitchenette with canned goods and dry food, a desk with logbooks, and a shortwave radio. No running water, just a gravity-fed tank from a spring up the hill. No electricity except what I could get from the generator or solar panel out back. It felt like something out of an older time, but I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. I always have. The first few days were uneventful. I'd wake up at dawn, hike out to the marked perimeters, check the trail cams, look for fresh tracks, and note anything out of the ordinary. I'd file a short report over the radio every evening. There were signs of elk and deer, a few old bear scat piles, and once I even saw a mountain lion print in a dry creek bed. I noted all of it and kept to my routines. The weather started to shift after the first week. A cold front rolled in, and with it came fog and light rain. The trees seemed to close in tighter when the fog came. Everything felt a little too quiet. I chalked it up to the weather. Animals go quiet before a storm. Still, something about those gray mornings made my skin feel tight, like I was being watched. One morning, around day 8, I found something that threw me off. I was on the Northwest Trail, near an old fire break, when I noticed one of the trail cams had been turned. Not broken, not missing, just rotated around so it faced the trunk of the tree it was strapped to. It didn't make sense. There hadn't been wind strong enough to turn it, and the strap was tight. I reset it and made a note. Figured maybe it had been bumped by an animal. The next day, another cam about a mile east was gone completely, strap and all. That same day, just before dusk, I saw smoke rising through the trees. It was thin and faint, but too close to be legal. Fires weren't permitted in that part of the forest without clearance. I grabbed my binoculars and hiked toward the smoke, careful to stay downwind and out of sight. After about 30 minutes, I found the remnants of a small campfire near the edge of a clearing. There were no tents, no gear, just the fire ring and some footprints in the mud. The prints were what bothered me. There were at least 2 sets, and one of them looked like it had been made by someone not wearing boots. No tread, just smooth-soled shoes or even barefoot. Who the hell hikes barefoot out here? I snapped photos, marked the GPS, and hiked back to the cabin as the light died. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside seemed louder. The trees creaked. The roof pinged with dripping water. I swear I heard movement on the porch just after midnight, but when I opened the door and stepped outside with my flashlight, there was nothing. No prints on the wet wood. No sign of anyone. I told myself I was just spooked. It happens. You spend enough nights alone in a cabin like that, and your brain starts filling in the silence. The next morning, I checked the cameras again. 2 more had been tampered with. One was smashed, the other gone. That was no animal. Someone was out here, and they knew where the cams were. I radioed it in to the district office, told them I suspected illegal camping or possibly squatters. They said they'd send someone out in a few days, but they were short-staffed and had a fire down near Buena Vista. The following 2 nights were the worst I'd had in years. On the first night, I heard movement outside again, only this time it wasn't on the porch. It was out past the tree line, toward the shed. Slow footsteps in the dead leaves. I cut the lights and sat by the window with my flashlight off, just watching. The moonlight through the trees gave just enough light to see shapes moving. There were two figures. One stood near the shed, the other closer to the trees. They didn't move like hikers. They weren't talking, just standing there, watching the cabin. I sat frozen for over an hour, heart pounding, barely breathing. Then, just like that, they were gone. No sounds of retreating steps, no rustling, like they'd vanished. To first light, I went to the shed. The lock had been broken clean off. Inside, the backup generator was gone. I found its tracks in the mud, leading back into the forest. Someone had dragged it away, probably on a tarp or sled. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to. That day, I packed my gear. I told myself I'd hike down early, head back to the district station, and request reassignment. I didn't sign up for whatever this was. I radioed in again, no response. The sat phone had no signal. The solar charger hadn't worked since the fog rolled in. I was cut off. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the stove cold, the lights off, and stayed by the window with my rifle on my lap. Just after 2 a.m., I heard something behind the cabin. A scraping sound, slow and steady. Then a thump like something being placed against the back wall. I didn't move. Eventually, the sound stopped. When morning came, I went out and found what they'd left. A pile of my gear, my spare boots, my second jacket, some food cans, stacked neatly on a wooden crate. My name tag from my duffel was hanging from a nail driven into the crate. Below it, carved into the wood with something sharp, was one word: stay. I didn't waste time. I packed my essentials, grabbed my rifle, and left. I left the cabin unlocked. I didn't care. I hiked 12 miles back down the mountain to the nearest forestry road, flagged down a truck, and got a ride back to the station. They sent a team up that weekend. They didn't find anything. The cameras were all missing. The crate was gone.
No prints.
No sign of anyone. They said maybe I was stressed. Maybe I misread the situation. I didn't argue. I handed in my report, transferred out of the region, and I've never taken another solo post since. I still think about that cabin. I still think about whoever or whatever was out there. It wasn't ghosts or some nonsense like that. It was people. Real people living off the grid, hiding deep in those woods. And they didn't want to be found. They were watching me from the moment I got there. They knew my routines, my routes, my weak spots. And when they were ready, they made sure I knew who was in control. But I left. I got out. That's the part one hold on to. That I left. And I never went back. I was 36 when I bought that stretch of land deep in the hills of southern Oregon. It was 2021, around early fall. I just sold my apartment in Eugene after my job downsized me, and with the bit of savings I had, I figured I'd finally do something I'd always wanted: build a cabin from scratch. Not one of those polished kits you see in magazines. Just a simple, hand-built, one-room cabin I could camp in, maybe rent out later or keep as a getaway. I didn't care if it took months. I needed to disappear for a while. The land was 23 acres, mostly wooded, backed up against a steep ridge with no one for miles around. The closest town, a place called Glendale, was about an hour away by truck, and the only way in was a single dirt road that wound around hills and dipped into a narrow valley. My cell service dropped 5 miles before I even reached the edge of my land. It was perfect. I had an old Chevy Silverado, loaded with tools, plywood, treated lumber, water cans, dry food, and a canvas tent. I pitched the tent about 30 yards from where I planned to build the cabin, close enough to the truck and the old logging trail that ran through the land. For the first week, the weather was dry and cool, and the work kept my mind off everything else. I cleared the building site by hand, used a chainsaw to take down some small firs, leveled the slope with a shovel, set stone pads for the foundation, then framed the floor. It was all manual labor, no machines, and the solitude was both peaceful and punishing. I'd wake up sore, make coffee over a small propane stove, work all day with gloves and sweat dripping down my back, then fall asleep with the sounds of owls or coyotes far off in the hills. By the second week, the frame of the cabin was up, 4 walls, no roof yet. I was working on the rafters when the rain started. First, it was light, just a mist that clung to the trees and made the needles shine. Then it thickened into a steady downpour that didn't let up. The first real rain of the season, and it didn't stop for 4 days. The dirt road in turned to mud. I had to park the truck further back along a flatter stretch to keep it from sinking. My boots squelched when I walked. The canvas tent got soaked and sagged at the seams. Water pooled at the base, soaking through my sleeping bag. I rigged a tarp above it, tied between some trees, and started sleeping in the truck instead. I wasn't going to stop building just because of the rain. By the third night of the storm, I was cold, wet, and exhausted. I'd spent the whole day hauling boards, trying to fix the makeshift tarp over the open cabin frame so I could work inside. I had no electricity, no heater, just a lantern and a small portable battery I used to charge a headlamp. That night, I decided I was going to sleep inside the unfinished cabin. I didn't care that it didn't have a roof yet. I'd hang the tarp above the beams and roll out my mat on the floorboards. It was better than the truck, and at least I'd be out of the wind. Around dusk, I moved my stuff into the cabin, just the basics: mat, sleeping bag, lantern, water, and my small tool bag. I left the rest in the truck. The rain was constant, steady, loud. It made the trees hiss. My tarp flapped and sagged, but it held. The cabin was dark inside, but the walls kept the wind out, and that was enough. I ate a cold can of beans with a spoon and tried to read by the light of the lantern. I didn't sleep much. Every little creak or pop outside had me stiffening up. Trees will groan in the wind, especially old ones, and branches snap off when they get heavy with rain. But there was something else. It wasn't the wind. It was a feeling, not paranoia, just something off. I lay there in my bag, staring at the shadows on the bare wood walls. I could hear the rain smacking the tarp above me, the thud of drops on the boards, and beyond that, faint cracking in the woods. It wasn't animals, not the small ones anyway. It was something bigger, something that took slow, heavy steps. At first I thought it was just a deer. They roam even in bad weather. But these steps didn't move like a deer. They paused. They shifted. They circled. I sat up and clicked off the lantern. Just listened. Nothing. Then a soft thud, like a boot stepping into wet dirt. I stayed still for a long time, just breathing. Eventually, I told myself I was just tired. I hadn't eaten well in days. Maybe I was imagining it. The rain can mess with your ears when you're in the middle of nowhere. So I lay back down and forced my eyes closed. But then I heard the tarp shift. Not from the wind, from weight. Something was on it. I shot up and grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on and aimed it up at the rafters. The beam caught the tarp fluttering, loose at the corner. Nothing was on it, just water pooling in the middle, stretching it down. Still, I couldn't relax. I left the flashlight on, kept it beside me, and barely slept an hour that night. The rain didn't stop once. In the morning, I climbed out of the bag, joints aching, back sore, and stared at the mess. The tarp had come loose at one end, so one corner of the cabin was soaked. A few tools had gotten wet. I dried what I could with a towel and set about trying to reinforce it. That's when I noticed the prints. Right outside the cabin, in the soft mud, were 2 partial boot prints. Not mine. They were fresh, made sometime during the night. Not animal tracks, boots. Heavy tread, maybe a size bigger than I wear. No other prints led in or out. Just those 2, side by side, facing the cabin wall. I looked around the woods, heart thudding in my chest. The trees stood silent, dripping. I didn't see anything moving, but I knew someone had been there. I grabbed the crowbar from the tool bag and walked the perimeter. Checked the trees. Nothing. No more prints. No path through the brush. It was like someone had just stood there, then vanished. I told myself it could have been an old set of prints the rain had uncovered. Maybe a hunter or logger had passed through months ago, and the mud just brought them back up. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I worked all day, eyes constantly flicking to the woods. I managed to nail up more boards and rig the tarp tighter. I didn't stop moving. I just wanted to finish enough of the cabin to make it safe. I had no signal to call anyone. No way to know if help could reach me anyway. That night, I debated sleeping in the truck. But something about the cab felt more exposed than the cabin. So I stayed. I didn't turn off the flashlight this time. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The tarp rattled harder. The trees shook and hissed. I curled tighter into the bag, crowbar by my side. Then I heard something again. Not steps this time. Breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. Right outside the wall. Stopped, started again. Then stopped. Couldn't move. I didn't dare shine the light. I just sat there in the dark, heart hammering in my chest. The breathing faded after a while. I don't know how long. Might have been minutes, might have been an hour. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound. When dawn came, I stepped outside and checked again. More prints. This time they circled the cabin. I packed my bag. I didn't even finish the roof. I walked straight to the truck, started it, and back down the trail. I didn't stop until I hit the pavement. I stayed in Glendale that night at a roadside motel. The woman at the front desk said the storm had knocked down a few power lines out there. I asked her if people lived up near the ridge. She just shook her head and said nobody had in years. I returned the next week with a friend and a shotgun. We found more prints, more signs that someone had been around the site. My crowbar was missing. My tarp had been slashed. I sold the land a month later. Never went back. Whoever it was didn't try to hurt me, but they were watching. They didn't want me there. I don't know if they lived in those woods or if they just passed through, but they saw me. They waited for the rain, waited for the night, and they wanted me gone. They got what they wanted, and I never tried to build another cabin again. It was the winter of 2004 when I found myself driving up into the woods near Kilbride, a remote corner of Newfoundland where the snow sits thick and silent from November until early April. I was 32 then, working part-time for a contractor out of St. John's. Most of my jobs were drywalled basements or insulating attics, but in early December, I got a call from a friend of my cousin's who said he needed someone to finish up a cabin. It had been framed, insulated, and half-paneled, but the guy who started it left mid-job. Apparently, he didn't give a reason, just walked away one day and never came back. The cabin was built on the edge of an old graveyard. I didn't know that until I got there. I left early in the morning, just after 5 a.m., with a thermos of coffee and a lunchbox. The drive took almost 3 hours on icy roads. It was still dark when I turned off the main road onto a rough, unplowed track. The trees on either side were heavy with snow, drooping like they were weighed down with secrets. I followed the path until I came to a clearing where the cabin sat, tilted slightly, quiet and alone. The graveyard was behind it, maybe 50 meters away, close enough that you could see the older headstones through the trees. They were the old kind, too thin and arched, some leaning, some broken in half. Most of the names had been worn off by weather, and there wasn't a sign of maintenance anywhere. Whoever was buried out there had been forgotten a long time ago. The cabin itself was simple: a single-room structure with a small loft overhead, a wood stove in the corner, and rough pine paneling on the interior walls. The last guy had done a decent job, but it was unfinished. There was no running water, no electricity. Just a place meant for someone who wanted to be left alone. I parked my truck, grabbed my gear, and stepped inside. The cold hit me hard. Inside the cabin, it was just as cold as outside, and even with gloves, my fingers went numb after 15 minutes of working. The first thing I did was get a fire going. I found some split birch logs in a stack by the door, along with some kindling. It took some effort, but eventually, I had flames flickering in the stove and the metal creaking as it heated. That first day, I focused on finishing the paneling. It was quiet work. The only sounds were the tapping of my hammer, the occasional rustle of wind outside, and the way the trees creaked when the wind moved through them. Around noon, I stepped out to eat. I leaned against the cabin and looked back toward the graveyard. There were no trails or signs that anyone had been out there. Just snow, untouched and deep, and the odd shape of those old stones poking through it. I didn't like being that close to it, if I'm honest. Not because I believe in ghosts or anything, but because it felt like being surrounded by history that wasn't mine. People long dead, buried with their secrets. Something about it made me feel like I didn't belong there. Still, it was good money, and I didn't have a lot of work lined up. I stayed late that day and decided to come back the next morning. The next few days followed the same routine. I'd wake up early, drive up, build a fire in the stove, and work until dusk. The light faded fast in the woods, especially with all the snow, and it wasn't safe to drive that road in the dark. I kept a shovel in the truck to clear the driveway in case the snow piled up, which it did relentlessly. Around the third or fourth day, I started noticing small things. Nothing dramatic, just small, strange things. I found boot prints in the snow behind the cabin. They were too large for mine, and they trailed off toward the graveyard. I assumed it was hunters or maybe someone hiking through the woods, but they didn't look fresh. More like someone had come by the day before and walked around without stopping. The next morning, those prints were gone, but there was a new set. A single trail this time, leading from the treeline up to the edge of the graveyard, then stopping at one of the oldest stones. I didn't like it. On the fifth day, I decided to stay overnight. The owner had given me permission. There was a cot in the loft, and I brought a heavy sleeping bag and enough food to get through the night. I wanted to make a full day's progress, and driving back and forth every day was starting to wear me out. That night was the coldest I've ever felt in my life. Even with the stove burning full, the inside of the cabin never got warm. The wind outside was constant, howling like something desperate. Around midnight, I woke up freezing. My fire had died down to embers. I climbed down from the loft to add more wood, and when I looked out the window, I saw someone, just standing at the edge of the graveyard. He wasn't moving, just a dark figure still as a statue. My first thought was that I was dreaming. I even rubbed my eyes, but he was still there. I didn't go outside. I shut the stove door and backed away. When I looked again a few minutes later, he was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found more footprints in the snow. This time, they came right up to the cabin. They stopped at the front step and then turned away. There was something else too. 2 deep scratches on the door. Not claw marks, not like an animal. These were long, straight gouges, as if someone had dragged a knife or a chisel along the wood. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was just some local messing around, maybe a trapper or someone living off-grid. I was being paid well, and I didn't want to call the job off and explain why I was spooked. So I stayed. The following days were tense. I stopped staying overnight. I kept a hatchet in my belt and made sure to keep the fire hot while I worked. I didn't see the man again, but I kept hearing things. Branches snapping in the distance, footsteps in the snow when the wind died down. Once even a low hum that I couldn't trace to any source. On the 9th day, I found something buried in the snow just behind the cabin. At first, I thought it was a root or some debris, but when I cleared the snow, I found an old, rusted toolbox. It had been there a long time. Inside was a bone-handled knife, a small saw, and a broken pocket watch. The tools were covered in rust, and the box smelled like oil and dirt. It felt wrong to hold them. I left it where I found it and didn't tell anyone. That night, I had a dream about the graveyard. In the dream, I was walking between the stones, and someone was following me. I couldn't see him, but I could hear his breathing, heavy, wet, like someone with a bad chest. I kept turning around, but there was nothing there. When I woke up, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The job was almost done by then. I had 2 days left, just trimming the last panels and securing the insulation in the loft. I worked fast, wanting to finish and never come back. The last night, I stayed late to wrap everything up. I didn't notice the prints until I stepped out to load my gear into the truck. There were dozens of them, footprints in the snow circling the cabin. Some came up to the door, others stopped by the windows. All of them were deep, fresh, and from boots larger than mine. I looked out toward the trees, but I didn't see anything. I got in the truck and locked the doors. As I was pulling away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a man step out of the woods and walk toward the graveyard. I didn't slow down. I drove back to town, straight to my cousin's place, and I told him everything. He didn't say much, just nodded and looked uncomfortable. He admitted later that the man who'd first started the cabin work had come back from that job acting strange. Said he wasn't sleeping, jumped at every noise. Eventually, he moved out west and stopped answering calls. I didn't go back. I left the tools there, figuring they weren't worth the trip. A year later, the cabin burned down. Nobody knew how. No fire report, no investigation. It just caught fire one night and burned to the ground. Nothing around it was touched. Not the trees, not even the grass. Just the cabin. Gone. The graveyard is still there, though. Untouched, still forgotten. I haven't been back to that part of Newfoundland since. I don't plan to. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits. But I know what it feels like when someone doesn't want you in a place. When someone is watching you. You don't need a face or a name to know when danger is close. You just feel it in your spine, in the cold, in the quiet, and you leave. You leave and don't go back. I was 36 the year I took the job at the old forestry cabin in Montana. It was 2019, early November, just before the snow started to stick for good. I'd been laid off in September from a logging outfit near Eureka, and things were getting tight. My savings were low, and bills were piling up fast. That's when I got a call from an old contractor I'd worked with back in 2012, a guy named Alan. He said a landowner needed someone to winterize a remote cabin up near Hollow Pine Ridge. It wasn't too far from the Idaho line. The pay wasn't anything wild, but it was enough to help me get by a few more months. I wasn't in a position to be picky. The job was simple on paper. Go out there, assess what needed sealing up before the real cold hit, check on some foundation issues, and clear out a mess left behind by a previous tenant. I figured I'd be up there a few days at most. He told me there'd be no cell service and no Wi-Fi, but I didn't care. I just wanted the paycheck. The place was about 18 miles off the nearest paved road. I took my old Tacoma, packed it with tools, a camp stove, a cooler full of food, and a cot. The last part of the drive took me up an old, badly maintained Forest Service road, weaving through thick pines and firs. By the time I reached the cabin, The sky was getting dark and I could feel the air starting to bite. The cabin sat at the base of a ridge, tucked into the trees with a wide clearing in front of it. It had a metal roof, 2 chimneys, and a wraparound porch. The kind of place that looked like it was built solid, maybe back in the 60s. Big stone foundation, a steel barrel for burning trash. The front door had a heavy-duty deadbolt, and the windows were covered in storm shutters that were half hanging off their hinges. The place smelled like old dust and dried pine when I stepped inside. No furniture, just some shelves, a busted rocking chair, and a few crates of junk in the corner. Whoever had stayed there before hadn't done much cleaning. There were beer cans, torn clothes, and some tools scattered across the floor. One corner of the cabin had water damage. The logs were darker there, soft to the touch. I set up my cot by the wood stove and started a fire with the kindling left in a bin outside. It didn't take long for the stove to warm the place up. I cracked open a can of chili and sat by the fire with my flashlight in my lap, just listening. Outside, I could hear the wind shift through the trees, then die off. It was dead quiet after that. No birds, no crickets, just nothing. That kind of silence makes your ears ring. The first night was uneventful, other than a loud creak outside around 2 in the morning. I figured it was a branch falling. This time of year, the wind can play tricks on your ears. The next day, I got to work checking the base of the cabin. The foundation on the east side had pulled away from the main structure a bit, probably due to frost heaving. I made a note to shore it up. I sealed some gaps in the window frames with foam and replaced a broken hinge on the back door. That's when I noticed something odd. There were drag marks in the dirt behind the cabin, like someone had pulled something heavy across the ground toward the treeline. I knelt down and ran my fingers through the tracks. They weren't fresh, maybe a week old at most, but they hadn't been washed away yet, and the shape reminded me of something wide and flat, maybe a tarp or a sled. I stood there a while, looking out toward the trees. The forest was dense past that point, choked with undergrowth and fallen branches. I didn't go looking. Back inside, I checked the attic. It was dusty and cramped, just high enough to crouch in. I found a few more items left behind. Some tarps, an empty rifle case, and a plastic crate full of canned food that had expired a decade ago. Nothing strange, but something about the way it was packed up made me uneasy, like whoever left it had done so in a hurry. That night, I barely slept. The wind had picked up and kept rattling the metal roof. At one point, I heard something knock against the porch. I sat up in my cot, flashlight aimed at the door, listening. Another knock, heavier this time. Then silence. I didn't open the door, just sat there until morning. On the third day, I hiked around the cabin to map out runoff patterns, part of the winterization checklist. I found more of those drag marks in the dirt near a dry creek bed. This time, fresher, less than 3 days old. I looked for boot prints but didn't see any. Just the same dragging motion through the pine needles and dead leaves. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint, but distinct, like rotting meat. I followed it about 15 feet toward the ridge and saw something tangled in the underbrush. It was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. Bones mostly, picked clean but not by scavengers. The ribs were cracked in half, and the skull was missing. I'd seen bear kills before. This wasn't that. I turned around and went straight back to the cabin. Something was off. Way off. That night, I locked the doors and kept the fire low. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard movement outside again. Slow, steady footsteps circling the cabin. I didn't breathe. I just lay there listening. The footsteps stopped at the back door. Then nothing. When I opened the door in the morning, there were boot prints. Old-style work boots with a deep tread. Someone had been standing there for a while, watching. I didn't waste time after that. I packed up what I could, made my notes on the repairs, and radioed Alan from a Forest Service tower 3 miles up the ridge. I told him the place wasn't safe. that someone had been hanging around out there. He brushed it off, said there were old trappers in the area and hunters that might pass through. Told me not to worry. I told him I was done. When I drove out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to follow. No one did. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Alan again. He sounded weird. Said something had happened at the Hollow Pine cabin. A group of snowmobilers found it burned to the ground. Fire investigators said it looked like someone had set the place alight from the inside. No sign of foul play, no bodies. Just ashes and some blackened foundation stones. Alan didn't ask me to go back out there. I didn't offer. I never found out who had been out there in the woods with me, or why they'd been watching. Maybe they'd been using the place before I showed up, and I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. Maybe the dragging tracks were just animal kills, and the footsteps were someone harmless. But I don't believe that. The way the place felt those last nights, the quiet, the way the trees seemed to close in, it was like the whole forest wanted me gone. Like something just outside the edge of the firelight was waiting for me to step out. I haven't gone back into the woods since, and I never will. I was 33 when I left the city. That year, 2017, I'd hit a wall in every part of my life. I was living in Bristol, working a boring warehouse job. I didn't hate it, but I didn't enjoy it either. The kind of job where days bleed into each other and weeks pass before you realize you've done nothing new. I'd broken up with someone that spring, and I hadn't really seen my mates since. Life had become a loop of early mornings, packed buses, late shifts, and instant meals. I needed a break. I wasn't looking for adventure or a life-changing experience. I just wanted a quiet place to think, somewhere away from traffic and screens. A mate at work mentioned his cousin had a place in the Peak District, a cabin, old, basic, but empty for the rest of the month. I didn't ask many questions. He gave me a number. I paid the cousin a few £100, and a week later I was on the road, heading north. The drive was long. It rained most of the way. By the time I passed Sheffield and headed into Derbyshire, it was already getting dark. The roads narrowed the deeper I went, winding through valleys and small villages. I followed the directions I'd been given, printed on a creased bit of paper in my glove box, since signal had died miles back. Eventually, I reached a gravel track that looked more like a footpath. Trees closed in on both sides. I had to slow down to a crawl. My car, a battered old Mondeo, scraped the branches as I inched forward. I started wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn when the track suddenly opened up. The cabin sat in a clearing, about 20 meters from the treeline. It looked older than I expected. Timber walls, a tin roof, small windows, and a narrow porch with broken steps. The forest surrounded it in all directions, thick with tall pines and mossy undergrowth. No neighbors, no roads. It felt like the kind of place no one stumbled on by accident. I parked beside the cabin, got out, and stretched my legs. The air was clean and damp. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the patter of rain on leaves. I unlocked the door with the key I'd been sent and stepped inside. The interior was simple. One large room, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a single bed in the corner, a small table, and an armchair by the window. A narrow door led to a tiny washroom with a compost toilet and a water barrel hooked up to the roof. No electricity, no gas. I lit a few candles that had been left on the table and unpacked my bag. That first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch for a bit, drank a beer, and watched the trees sway in the wind. I had no signal and no way to charge my phone, so I left it off and read a book by candlelight until I got too tired. I fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof. The second day passed quietly. I hiked a bit, explored the nearby woods, and cooked simple meals on a camping stove. The solitude felt good. I didn't think about work or the city. I didn't check my phone. I didn't even feel bored. That night, I built a fire in the old fireplace and sat in front of it for hours. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, but I felt safe and warm inside. It wasn't until the third night that something changed. I was brushing my teeth at the sink beside the cabin, using bottled water, when I heard something behind me, a branch snapping. Not a squirrel or a bird, something heavier. I turned around and looked toward the treeline. It was nearly dark, and the shadows were long. I didn't see anything at first, but then I caught a glimpse of movement, just for a second. Someone stepping back behind a tree. I stood still, toothbrush in hand, and waited. Nothing. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks in the low light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I went inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going longer than usual. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone outside, standing in the dark, staring through the window. By morning, I felt stupid for letting it bother me. I made coffee, went for a walk, and convinced myself I'd been jumpy for no reason. But as I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud, near the edge of the clearing. Not mine. These were smaller and barefoot. I crouched and looked closer. The prints were fresh. The rain had stopped during the night, and the ground was still damp. Whoever made them had been out there recently. They came from the woods and stopped about 10 feet from the cabin, then turned back. I didn't know what to make of it. A hiker? A local kid? It didn't make sense. There were no other houses nearby. And who walks barefoot in the woods in late October? I spent the rest of the day feeling on edge. I kept checking the windows, listening for sounds. I didn't go far from the cabin. I started keeping my knife, a folding one I used for camping, in my pocket. That night, I stayed inside. I didn't light a fire, just in case it made me too visible. I read with a torch under a blanket and tried to ignore how loud the forest sounded now. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, felt like a footstep. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard knocking. 3 slow knocks on the door. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, heart racing. Another knock, louder this time, then silence. I grabbed my knife and crept toward the window beside the door. I pulled the curtain back just a crack. There was a woman standing on the porch, barefoot, dressed in something pale, maybe a nightgown. Her hair was long, wet, hanging down past her shoulders. I couldn't see her face clearly. She wasn't looking in, just standing there, facing the door. She didn't move, just stood there for what felt like minutes. Then, without warning, she turned and walked off the porch into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. The grass was wet, and I could see her footprints on the steps, in the dirt, clear as day. She'd been real. I wasn't losing it. I followed the prints to the edge of the clearing. They disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't go after them. That day, I packed my things. I didn't want to stay another night. I hadn't seen a soul in 3 days except for her, and something about her felt wrong. It wasn't just the fact she was barefoot and alone in the woods. It was the way she moved, slow, like she was half asleep. The way she stood at the door, silent, like she was waiting for something. I loaded my car and tried to leave, but the track was blocked. A tree had come down during the night. It wasn't massive, but it was thick enough that I couldn't drive over it. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. I didn't have a saw or anything useful. I was stuck. I decided to hike to the nearest village. According to the directions, there was a small town about 5 miles east. I figured I could get help there. I locked up the cabin, took a bag with essentials, and set off. The trail was rough and barely marked, but I kept going. After a couple of hours, I reached a narrow road. I followed it until I found a farmhouse. I knocked. An older man answered. I told him about the fallen tree and asked if he could help or call someone. He nodded and said he'd drive out with a chainsaw. While we waited, I asked him about the cabin. He looked at me for a long time. That place been empty for years, he said. Used to belong to a woman. Lived alone. Bit odd. Kept to herself. I didn't say anything. She went missing one winter. Never found. People say she got lost in the woods. Others say she didn't want to be found. I nodded. Said I was just renting it. He didn't say much else. We drove back. He cleared the tree. I thanked him and offered money, but he refused. I left the cabin that afternoon. I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone about the woman. What would I even say? That some barefoot woman knocked on the door and walked into the woods? I thought about her for weeks after, wondered who she was, if she was real, if she needed help, if she was dangerous. I tried to forget, but a month later, I got a parcel at my flat in Bristol. No return address. Inside was an envelope with old photographs. Black and white. A cabin. The clearing. A woman standing on the porch. Same long hair. Same pale dress. On the back of one photo, in shaky handwriting, was a single line. Still here. That night, I changed the locks on my flat. I haven't been back to the countryside since. I was 28 when I went back to my grandma's cabin alone for the first time. It had been almost 6 years since I'd last been there, and back then, I wasn't paying much attention to anything other than swimming in the lake and hiking the old trails with my cousins. But this time was different. My grandma had passed away the previous fall, and the family hadn't decided what to do with the cabin yet. It sat untouched through the winter. Then spring rolled in and I offered to go up and check on it. Mostly, I just wanted some quiet. The cabin was up in northern Maine, about 2 hours from the nearest real town. It wasn't a big place, just a square-shaped, one-story structure with faded red paint and a tin roof that popped and groaned in the sun. There was no internet, no cable, and barely any cell reception unless you stood near the window over the sink. But it had electricity, running water from a well, and an old propane stove that still worked. It was enough. I arrived on a cloudy Thursday morning in late May, driving up the long gravel path that curved off the main road and ran through a thick patch of pine. It had rained the night before, so the trees were dripping, and the road was soft and muddy in places. The moment I pulled up and turned off the engine, the silence hit me hard. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in a quiet neighborhood. It was deep, the kind that makes your ears ring a little. I walked around the outside first. The cabin looked the same. The front porch sagged a little more than I remembered, but nothing was broken. The windows were intact. The door was locked, which I figured was more habit than necessity out there. I let myself in and stepped into the musty warmth of old wood, dust, and time. Everything was exactly where she'd left it. Her rocking chair in the corner, the quilt on the couch, even her boots by the door. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning. I opened the windows, swept out the spiders, and wiped down the surfaces. I didn't touch her things much. I just cleared enough space to live around them for a few days. I unloaded my groceries into the tiny fridge and set up my cot in the guest room. I didn't want to sleep in her bed. Felt wrong. The first night was quiet. I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the light fade behind the trees. It got cold fast, like it always did out there, and by 9 I was wrapped in a hoodie, staring at the stars. Around midnight, I woke up to something tapping against the side of the cabin. I froze under the blanket, heart racing. It was soft, irregular, not like footsteps, more like something brushing the wood. Eventually, it stopped. I listened for a while longer and then fell back asleep. In the morning, I chalked it up to branches, or maybe a raccoon. There was a lot of wildlife out there, and the woods had always been full of sounds. I made myself breakfast and took a walk down the path to the lake. The trail was overgrown, but still there. I followed it past the mossy boulder, around the fallen birch tree, and finally out into the clearing by the water. The lake was calm and gray under the cloudy sky. I sat on the edge of the dock, let my feet dangle, and felt the quiet settle over me again. That's when I saw something strange. Across the lake, near the opposite shore, there was a person standing in the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, maybe 50 yards away. I couldn't make out details, just that it was a tall figure in dark clothes. I squinted. They were too far to see clearly, but they weren't fishing or hiking. They were just there, watching. I sat still for a long minute. I didn't wave. I didn't move. Finally, I looked down at the water, then back up again. The figure was gone. I told myself it was probably just a hiker, someone cutting through the woods. Still, it left a bad taste in my mouth. I walked back slower than usual, constantly looking over my shoulder. The trees pressed in on both sides, heavy and silent. I made it back to the cabin without seeing anyone else, but the feeling stayed with me. That night, I double-locked the door. The next morning, I found footprints. They were just outside the back door. 2 sets. One was mine. I recognized the tread from my boots, but the other wasn't. It was larger, wider, a heavy step like someone in work boots. The prints were pressed deep into the mud, as if someone had walked through during the night, maybe after the rain. I stared at them for a long time. They led toward the tree line and vanished into the underbrush. I didn't know what to do. There was no one nearby to call. No ranger station, no neighbor, just me. I took a photo on my phone in case I needed it later. I spent the rest of the day inside. I read. I made soup. I watched the road through the small kitchen window. Nothing. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt loaded, like they were watching me back. At sunset, I heard the tapping again. This time it came from the front. I turned off the lights and moved to the window. I waited a long time but saw nothing. No movement, no shapes, just trees. I barely slept that night. On the 4th day, I packed a bag. I told myself I was just going to head back to town, maybe cut the trip short. I had no real reason to stay. The cabin was fine, but part of me just wanted to get away from the woods. I put my duffel in the car and made one last check around the outside. That's when I found something worse than the footprints. Hanging from the porch railing was a piece of rope, about a foot long, tied into a noose. It was looped through one of the support beams, swinging slightly in the breeze. The rope was old and frayed, like something taken from a barn or a shed. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of it. My grandma didn't keep rope out there. There wasn't even a shed on the property. I looked around. No tracks, no sound, just the same heavy quiet. I pulled the rope down and threw it in the trash, then locked the car and started to drive. I made it less than a mile before I had to stop. In the rearview mirror, I saw a man standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes. He was maybe 50 feet behind me, just standing there on the gravel, staring straight at the car. He was wearing dark clothes and a hat, and I could tell right away it was the same shape I'd seen across the lake. I didn't get out. I didn't even put the car in reverse. I kept driving. I didn't look back again until I reached the main road, and by then he was gone. I drove the full 2 hours back to Bangor without stopping. I didn't check my mirrors. I didn't stop for gas. I got to my apartment and locked the door behind me and just stood there for a long time. I didn't tell anyone about it at first, not even my sister, who'd spent summers at that cabin with me. I felt like maybe I'd imagined it, that maybe it was just my head playing tricks. But the photos I took, the footprints, the rope, they were real. And every time I looked at them, I felt that same creeping dread. A few weeks passed, then a month. Life went back to normal. I went back to work, went out with friends, did everything I normally did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. I started noticing things. Scratches on my apartment door, a piece of rope on the stairs. One night, I found dirt on my welcome mat. Even though I'd been out all day, it was like someone had been there, just close enough to leave a trace. Eventually, I went to the police. I didn't tell them the whole story, just that I thought someone might be messing with me. They didn't do much. Took a report, said to call if it escalated. It escalated 2 weeks later. I came home to find my apartment door cracked open. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But someone had gone through my stuff. The drawers were slightly out of place. The bedroom closet door was half open. My cot, the one I used at the cabin, was gone. Just gone. That night, I checked into a motel and stayed there for 2 weeks. During that time, I had the locks changed, added cameras, and asked my friend Mike to stay with me for a while. He didn't know the whole story, but he could tell I was on edge. The cameras helped. A few nights later, one of them caught something. A man, tall, wearing a hat, standing across the street just out of reach of the porch light. He didn't come closer. He didn't move. Just stood there for almost 15 minutes, then left. I gave the footage to the cops, and they finally took it seriously. They put a unit on the block for a few nights. Nothing happened. I didn't see the man again. Eventually, things calmed down. No more rope, no more dirt, no more visits. But I never went back to the cabin. Last I heard, my uncle sold the land to a private buyer. Some couple from Massachusetts who wanted to renovate it. I never met them. I never told them what happened. Maybe it's better they don't know. Now, almost 3 years later, I still think about that week. I still wonder who he was, why he was there, why he picked me. I don't have answers. All I know is it was real, every bit of it, and I'll never go back to that place again.